Dr. Joshua Blank, Research Director at the Texas Politics Project at UT. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. So your reaction to last night, the Republican statewide all holding their seats, all winning by double digits.
Yeah, I don't think in the end it was terribly surprising. And I know that it's always easy after an election to say, well, this is what we thought was going to happen. But, all of the polling leading up to this point gave Republicans healthy, if not pretty comfortable leads in all of the major statewide races. And then when we look more broadly at the national environment, and in particular, even at the Texas environment, both really had evolved throughout the end of the election in a way that really favored Republicans if they hadn't already been favoring, Republican candidates from the start.
You're right. I mean, the Democrats knew last year this was going to be a tough year for them, and based on historical purposes. But then when you look at what the top issues were, inflation, border, and crime, you're saying that really was the message that trumped everything.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, Texas is not, Pennsylvania, for example. And if you look at some of the exit polling out of Pennsylvania, a nominally Democratic state, the top issue that people were raising there was abortion. So it's not surprising to see the Democratic candidate get pushed over the finish line there. In Texas, we've never seen an environment that looked like that in this cycle. And you're right, the issues that voters, persistently raised were the border and inflation. And then I think, largely due to, the effectiveness of a lot of the Republican campaigns, public safety, started to rise as we got closer and closer to election day. These are three issues that if you're a Republican candidate with a Democratic administration in the White House, I'm sure you were licking your lips before the campaign even started, thinking about what would happen and how easy it might be. Now, the only interesting thing is that, nationally, if not necessarily in Texas, it wasn't that easy.
And I wanted to ask you, when you look at some of the counties where Governor Abbott won, he did win some border counties. He won Uvalde County by 22 percentage points, 60-38. So what's your impression of that? Did that surprise you that the governor won by that much, especially since O'Rourke repeatedly campaigned there, repeatedly talked about, gun sale restrictions, talked with the families of the victims, included them in his commercials. So what do you make of all that?
Well, as important of an issue as gun violence was in this election, and in particular to Hispanic voters, most Hispanic voters, like most voters in Texas, were really still concerned about inflation and the economy. And I think, it's a little bit early to talk about, the full impact, I think, of Republican efforts to mobilize voters in South Texas. But I think, early on, sort of really in the hours in some ways after the election is over, as we're sitting here talking about this, when you look at those results, it doesn't look like Republicans made massive gains in terms of actual vote counts in a lot of these places. They may have, fundamentally shifted the vote percentages a little bit. But when we look, for example, at the Rio Grande Valley, Democrats tended to still do very well in most of those counties and still tended to get a majority of the vote in those counties. But in a down year for Democrats, in some cases, that wasn't going to be enough. For example, in Congressional District 15.
And I wanted to ask you a little bit about Dan Patrick and Ken Paxton, because the polls were accurate, because leading into the election, the lieutenant governor was ahead of Mike Collier by about 11 percentage points, and that's what it ends up being. And then Ken Paxton was averaging about 9 percentage points over Rochelle Garza, and he came out ahead by 11 percentage points. And he has legal issues, but you and I have discussed this before. That obviously is not a top concern.
Well, it's not. And to be honest, to the extent that voters know about the legal problems of the current, attorney general, that knowledge, number one, is heavily concentrated among Democratic voters who were not going to vote for Ken Paxton under any circumstances. And for those Republican voters who are aware of Ken Paxton's legal problems, whether because they follow politics closely, or maybe they followed the primary campaign, or have just become aware, due to the course of the 2022 campaign, in many cases, these voters had already cast a ballot for Ken Paxton while he was under indictment in the last election. And so the idea that this is, somehow a problem for him was, I think, a possibility that stirred a lot of imagination, especially combined with the Dobbs decision and Texas's, decision to subsequently prohibit abortion in the state. The idea was that this race might be a little bit different than the other ones, but ultimately that was more of an idea than a reality. Rochelle Garza, ultimately, as attractive of a candidate as she may have been, was still a Democratic candidate in Texas who began the race with no name recognition, completely a non-entity in the electorate, who then had to spend most of the campaign introducing herself. Ultimately, at the end, it's not surprising to find that Ken Paxton, Dan Patrick, and Greg Abbott all performed pretty similarly, and the Democratic candidates challenging them also all performed pretty similarly. And that's a reflection of the polarized political environment we live in, and the difficulty, I think, at this point of any issue to really disqualify a candidate as long as that candidate is a member of your party.
When you go back and you look at the issues that the state has faced, Uvalde, the winter storm from 2021 with the widespread power outages, and I'm wondering the fact that Beto O'Rourke raised even more money than the governor, which hasn't been done before, and attracted big crowds, and the fact that he still lost by almost as much as a percentage to Lupe Valdez, who didn't have nearly the resources that O'Rourke was able to have. What does that say about Beto O'Rourke and just Democrats statewide?
Well, I mean, I think those are two different questions. I mean, I think for Democrats statewide, it really points to the challenges that Democrats face. Ultimately, Texas is becoming a more competitive state, but for Democrats to be competitive, they are heavily reliant on the overarching conditions. Democrats can't have a bad or even merely an okay election nationally and have Texas Democrats expecting to turn Texas blue. Ultimately, they need something that is heavily in their favor, like they faced in 2018 and to a lesser extent in 2020. And I think that's where the difference is when thinking about O'Rourke, and especially comparisons with Lupe Valdez. I think you're right to point out that Lupe Valdez was an under-resourced and in many ways underwhelming candidate in that campaign, in which Democrats had a lot of wind at their back. But likewise, as high quality of a candidate as O'Rourke is, there's only so much he can do in an environment that was always going to be tough for any Democrat, even a Democrat as well known and well resourced as O'Rourke, given the fact that with a Democrat in the White House, with economic concerns, rampant, and with incredibly low, job approval for that president in the state, it would have taken some sort of Herculean effort and probably or some kind of major, if not multiple major mistakes by the incumbent to even really put Democrats within, I would say, a reasonable distance to be competitive this cycle. So for that, I wouldn't say that I would just attribute less to O'Rourke than in this than many would. I think in 2018, O'Rourke was given a lot of credit, some of which he deserved, but some of which was also due to the fact that Democrats were running candidates up and down the ballot throughout the state, and the Democratic voters wanted to cast a ballot against Donald Trump. In 2022, a third of the legislature, after redistricting, was elected without an actual contest because they faced no challenger. And what we're returning to is a more, ho-hum political environment, which ultimately has tended to favor Republicans in this state. And so I think you have to take all that into context when thinking about, O'Rourke's role, his success and or his failure, whether you're talking about, his quote unquote successes in 2018, or if you want to talk about his failures in 2022.
The governor's campaign held a news conference, sort of just going through the election this morning, and they said that O'Rourke's unfavorables were still higher than his favorables, and he never changed that during the course of this election. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's a fair assessment, but I think it also leaves out the fact that voter attitudes towards Governor Abbott were rather ambivalent as well. The governor was barely ever in positive waters in his job approval ratings, and same holds with the favorability numbers. So yes, it's true that O'Rourke was never able to uh, get out of the basement in terms of voter attitudes towards him. But it wasn't as though this was an election in which you could say, but the voters really liked Greg Abbott. They didn't like Beto O'Rourke. Reality is the voters were not really impressed with either candidate, and they chose continuity over change.
I was just going to say, I mean, but at the end of the day, 11 percentage points is still 11 percentage points, no?
Yeah, it definitely is. But I would say this is also more of just a return to what we think of as kind of a normal Texas election. This is what Texas elections look like when Democrats are not as motivated as they were in 2018 and 2020, and Republicans are motivated.
And
But
I
it's
was just
not.
going
But
I'm
I'll also
sorry.
point out in 2014, Greg Abbott won by 20 points. So it's not as though this actually isn't, again, this is sort of something that I say that I think for the benefit of Democrats who start to get disheartened by this, but ultimately political change is slow. And if you start to look around at the results in some of these pockets around the state where Democrats feel like they're gaining in and around the big cities, ultimately you look at those numbers, and right now, based on the preliminary results, Beto O'Rourke seems to have been performing better as a percentage of the vote in many of those areas than certainly Wendy Davis did, certainly than Lupe Valdez did. And Greg Abbott is performing worse in those areas. So for Democrats who want to, look at this and say maybe we should just give up, the reality is that the change that they've been, that's been sort of fueling their optimism is actually still happening, even if the overall vote margins look worse this time around.
In Dallas County, the county has become even more solid blue than it was before because the Republicans didn't pick up any state house seats as they hoped, and all the countywide stayed Democrat. And in addition, the commissioner's court is now Democratic, all Democrat for the first time, in part because they redrew the one Republican district as a Democratic district. What does that say to you?
Look, this is an important story here in Texas that I think needs to be understood, which is the continuing bluing of Texas's cities is a really big deal in this state. A lot of the attention this cycle has been on vote shares in parts of South Texas that, when taken in consideration of the entire election, account for a very, very, very tiny share of the overall vote in the state, as opposed to a Harris County or a Dallas County or a Bexar County. And so what I think is going to be interesting in these coming days is a comparison of, how much did Republicans pick up in their statewide vote for all the efforts they put into South Texas, and how does that compare to the gains that Democrats seem to continue to be making in places like Dallas County, Harris County, and even, already extremely blue Travis County. And so I think, when we go back and try to take a little bit more of a holistic look at this election, try to understand the various moving parts, it's going to be interesting to see what role the bluing of Texas's urban areas has on our understanding of the trajectory of the state as a whole.
And my final question to you, and I appreciate your time, and that is Tarrant County remains solid red. The governor won there by, I think, 4 percentage points, 51 to 47. Dan Patrick won 50 to 47. Ken Paxton won 50 to 47. And all the countywides won and are solidly Republican. And so I'm wondering, what does that say to you about that? I mean, that's the largest Republican county in Texas. It stayed that way. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, Tarrant County remains a very interesting bellwether for Texas. It was, for a very long time, the largest Republican county in the state, and only in the previous two cycles did Democrats narrowly capture it. I think to expect that it would remain a Democratic county in perpetuity would be a little bit unrealistic. And so it's not surprising to see the county flip back in a more conservative direction, especially considering, honestly, the nature of all the political activity that's been going on in and around Tarrant County and the types of issues that have really been centralized around education. I think has really promoted a much more conservative brand of politics this cycle. But having said that, I don't necessarily think that if Donald Trump were on the ticket in 2024, Tarrant County is automatically going to be in the Republican column.
So it just depends on who's topping the ticket.
Definitely depends on who's on the top of the ticket, but it also depends on the overall environment. And in a county as competitive as Tarrant County, it's not surprising to see in an election, especially in the state that favored Republicans, for Tarrant to come back into the Republican column. It just is to say that in another election cycle that might favor Democrats more strongly, you could see Tarrant County inch back over into the Democratic column. I think it wouldn't be surprising to see it move back and forth for a little bit over the next few election cycles, depending on the conditions.
And Senator Ted Cruz is up for election in 2024, and everybody's waiting to see if he's going to run for re-election or run for president, based likely on what former President Donald Trump decides to do.
Yeah, I mean, Ted Cruz certainly has a lot of options at his disposal going forward, and it'll be interesting to see what he decides the next best move is for him. But no matter what, I think he will be a major player, certainly in the way that Texans view politics in the next election cycle.
Dr. Joshua Blank, Research Director at the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, we appreciate your insight.
Thanks for having me.